arms across the concrete. Boys, no wrestling at school! I work in an after-school care environment, and these have been my realistic experiences with how kids are allowed to move around. Kids are constantly being told not to climb on that tree, not to run on the concrete, and they're really restricted in how active they can be and how much free play they're allowed to do. So this kind of spurred our research. We wanted to know what was the influence behind this. Was it perceived fears of the teachers and of the school or of the parents and the pressure that they put on to ensure their kids' safety? Or was it really more to do with the policies that influenced how kids could move around and the risk management and OH&S agendas? So we wanted to transfer what I'd seen in my primary school environment to a secondary school environment and research really focusing in on those policies.
So initially we really wanted to look at the amount of time that kids do physical activity in the school environment and how policies and OH&S and risk management affects that. However, we found it almost impossible to research because of how broad the topic was, so we narrowed it down to this statement. We wanted to understand how policies and OH&S risk management agendas have had an influence on the free movement and activity of children in the school environment. So this obviously is reflected in the policy layer of Salas's socio-ecological model.
So we decided to conduct some interviews on teachers for our research. We conducted interviews on high school teachers, didn't do any on primary school teachers. Just because, we could get some good quality of data that way rather than, a survey or anything. An interview really gave us some good data.
Alright, so these are the 5 questions that we based our interview around, and we found some very interesting and some very contrasting findings. So question number 1, what risk management has been conducted on this particular school environment really varied across schools. Some teachers knew very, very little about what happened in terms of OH&S and risk management in their school, and so they really didn't have any. Some had, a booklet that they could just go over and read, and that was as far as it stretched. And au contraire, on the other side of things, we had some schools that really involved in risk management. They had lots of PDs, they had regular meetings with OH&S staff, they had an annual audit where they walked around the schools and checked out the environment to see what needed to be fixed up and what was a bit unsafe. And so there were really contrasting findings in what we had from our schools.
The second question we asked was, how would you describe the level of importance that school places on risk management and OH&S? We found some contrasting themes here. Some schools placed a very low importance on risk management with no attempt whatsoever to control, free play. But in a lot of the schools it was developing. It's just that the structures of the schools didn't allow the time and the resource for the teachers to really develop, any management. But in some schools there was a very, very high importance placed on these things, with a lot of the onus being put on the teachers rather than the students. It was the teachers' job to control, the students and make sure, rather than, the students taking the onus on themselves.
Okay, so the third question we looked at was, what sort of policies does the school have in regards to how students are allowed to move and be active around their school environment? So the main thing that came up in this question was the areas that students were allowed to be active in. So there was a lot of restriction on out-of-bounds areas where students weren't allowed to go during their free time, and restricted areas where certain sports were only allowed to be played in those areas. Maybe even on the concrete, students weren't allowed to run or play certain ball games. So really the area that students were allowed to move in and the policies surrounding those areas were the main things that affected the activity levels of students in their school environment. But there were also a few other things that we came across that the teachers brought up. So things like how much time the students had to be active around the school, short recess times, short lunch times, that played a part as well as uniform policies. That was a really major thing that restricted how active students could be around their school. That's probably about it.
Okay, so question 4, how would you describe the level of concern teachers and staff have with enforcing the above policies? Very much related to the amount of importance that the school put on their OH&S and risk management. So the more emphasis the schools seem to put on this sort of things, the more emphasis or the more concern the teachers seem to have. So those schools where they didn't really know the risk management strategies and the policies that were involved, they really didn't have much concern. They weren't too concerned with what the students were doing, whereas those where risk management, OH&S was within the culture there, they were having PDs and stuff like that, they had a lot more concern and they were a lot more aware of where students were going wrong.
The final question we asked was, how would you say these policies affect how active the children are around the school? We found that the policies didn't affect the physical activity levels as such, more the type of physical activity that could be done. Uniform policies and, say, rules about not being allowed to kick a ball in the quadrangle had more effect on the physical activity than the risk management OH&S regulations had. It also came up that physical activity was restricted to certain areas at certain times.
Before we conducted our interviews, we did some thorough research into physical activity in the school environment and the policies that could affect this. Some of the articles focused on school policies such as SunSmart policies or risk management regulation policies, and others discussed recess and the importance of recess for kids' physical activities, and that some schools didn't even have a recess because of the risks it imposed. However, we couldn't find any substantial proof that any of these policies actually affected kids' physical activity levels in a school. They also discussed how teachers viewed risk management and OH&S policies. And one book even talked specifically about games that kids should play at recess and what they could learn from these games, which highlights how overregulated the school environment can be sometimes. And most of the articles talk about the importance of the school environment to kids' physical activity. All these articles can be found on our Weebly website, www.isitbrentalcall.weebly.com.
So after looking at all those articles in that body of research, we sort of found that there was a lack of research in the department about policy in schools and how that affects children's physical activity. So that led us to our question that I told you before about understanding how policies and OH&S risk management agendas have an influence on the free movement and activity of children in the school environment. So our results, as we've pointed out, probably the three main results that we have was that it affected the areas, the times and the type of movement that the children experienced within their environment. Not so much what we expected, which was probably that there were really, really strict agendas and OH&S management policies in the environment, but even though they weren't that strict, they still had an influence on different areas.
Thanks heaps for watching our presentation. We hope we didn't bore you to tears. If you have any questions now, feel free to ask them and we'll try and answer them as best we can.